As soon as I sank into the plush seat of my private jet, my Maltese suddenly began barking unusually loud, forcing me to look around. To my shock, I discovered a tube of lubricant gel left behind under the seat. My son hasn't used this jet for years. Only my daughter-in-law has. The realization chilled me to the bone and raised a disturbing question. Had she been doing something indecent on this jet with someone? To find out, I quietly swapped the gel tube with a tube of capsaicin cream. If you want to know what happened next, make sure to subscribe, like this video, and comment where you're listening from. Then sit back and hear me tell the rest of the story. I was only in my 20s when I became a widow. People whispered that a young woman like me could never handle the empire my husband left behind. He had built a small but promising perfume business, a brand that carried his name and our shared dreams. When he passed suddenly, I stood in the ruins of that dream, staring at invoices, warehouses, and lawyers who looked at me as if I were a child lost in a storm. I remember those first nights when grief wrapped around me like a shroud. But grief never paid a single bill. I forced myself to get up each morning, to sit at the long oak desk in his study, and to learn the language of contracts, margins, and export taxes. I studied harder than I had ever studied in school, because failure would mean losing not only the business, but also my dignity. Over time, the business grew under my hand. I had an instinct for scent, for what women wanted to wear when they entered a ballroom or when they simply wished to feel alive again. I traveled to Paris and Milan, I shook hands with investors in New York, and I turned my husband's small venture into a luxury brand that graced magazines and adorned the shelves of the richest boutiques in Europe. People began to call me a self-made woman, though I always whispered to myself that I was also a woman rebuilt from ashes. By the time I turned 60, I was no longer the fragile widow people pitied. I was the woman who entered a room and drew eyes not only because of my diamonds, but because of the way I carried my head high, because of the certainty in my voice. In the circles of the wealthy, my name carried both admiration and envy. Women admired my strength, men respected my cunning, and a few whispered rumors about how I must have been ruthless to climb so high. Perhaps they were right. In America, success often comes with shadows. Still, when I looked in the mirror, I did not see ruthlessness. I saw a survivor, a woman who had every reason to collapse yet chose to fight. That choice had shaped me more than wealth ever could. By the time I retired, the Anderson estate had become more than a house. It was a stage where the image of a perfect family was performed each week. My son Liam and his wife Natalie lived under my roof, and to the world we appeared harmonious. Guests were greeted by the glow of chandeliers, the laughter of friends, the clinking of cocktail glasses on Saturday evenings. The driveway was always lined with polished cars, and people in tailored suits strolled through the garden as if we were hosting a permanent gala. I kept my smile steady, pouring champagne and nodding to compliments about how fortunate I was to have a united family. Yet behind that glitter, there were fissures. I noticed them in the way Liam sometimes looked down at his plate rather than at his wife, in the way Natalie's hand stiffened when he tried to touch hers. At dinner, the silence stretched too long. The clatter of silverware on china was often louder than their conversation. I tried to fill the emptiness with small talk, but the strain was always there, a silent guest at our table. The relatives noticed too. They would ask, half joking, half prying, when there would be the sound of children running through the halls. It had been 3 years since their wedding, and in a family like ours, children were not just a joy, but an expectation. Each question made Liam's shoulders tighten, and Natalie would force a laugh, brushing it aside as if it were silly gossip. But I saw the way her eyes sharpened afterward, as if the words had pierced her pride. I wanted to believe in the picture of serenity. I wanted to believe that the estate, so carefully built, was the safe harbor I had dreamed of when I fought to keep the business alive. But sometimes at night, when I walked the long marble halls and saw Natalie pacing on her phone in hushed tones, or when I found Liam lingering too long in the study with a glass of whiskey, I felt the truth pressing against me. This was not the peace I had earned. It was a fragile play, and I could feel the curtain beginning to tremble. Liam was 35 and carried the kind of charm that drew people to him. The easy smile, the loud laugh, the way he could make friends out of strangers in a crowded bar. But beneath the charm was a weakness he refused to face. Years of late nights, whiskey bottles drained, and parties that stretched until dawn had left their mark on him. He wanted a child more than anything, yet every test came back with the same quiet verdict. His body no longer had the strength to answer that desire. I watched him sit in the doctor's office, his hands clenched, his jaw tight, as the physician explained the reality in careful medical terms. I did not need translation. I saw the shame in my son's eyes, a shame he tried to bury under another glass of bourbon. In the Anderson family, children were not only blessings, they were proof that the line would continue, that the estate and the fortune would pass into steady hands. To the outside world, we lived in splendor, but within the walls of tradition, there was always the unspoken law of succession. Without a child, Liam carried a silent question mark over his head. Relatives would whisper when they thought I was not listening. They wondered if he was truly fit to inherit the mantle of our family name. Natalie understood this better than anyone. She wore her disappointment like a veil, at once subtle and suffocating. At family gatherings, she would sigh when children played nearby, casting a look that was meant to appear wistful, but in truth, cut like a blade at Liam's pride. In private, I overheard her words sharp as needles, wrapped in the silk of concern. She would say that she was worried, that time was slipping away, that maybe they should seek other solutions. On the surface it was worry, but I recognized the undertone. It was accusation. I could see the tension weaving itself into the fabric of their marriage. The once effortless laughter between them grew thin. The long walks they used to take around the estate ended sooner, with Natalie striding ahead and Liam trailing behind. He carried the weight of expectation, and she carried the weapon of dissatisfaction. Together they created a silence heavier than any storm. I wanted to step in, to remind them that love should not be measured in heirs, that a marriage is not only about producing the next Anderson. But in this house, in this family, such truths were drowned out by the louder voices of tradition and wealth. And so the crack in their marriage widened, quiet at first, invisible to guests, but I could feel it every time I sat at the head of the dining table and saw the space between them, wider than any ocean. I still remember the night it all began, though at the time none of us realized the weight of my words. It was one of those family gatherings when the house was alive with music and chatter. Glasses clinked, the dining room glowed with candlelight, and laughter echoed through the halls. Perhaps I had taken one glass of wine too many, or perhaps I was simply trying to lighten the mood. Surrounded by cousins and uncles, I raised my voice and said, half in jest, half in truth, that whoever gave me a grandchild would inherit my private jet and a sizable share of the estate. The table burst into laughter, people teased Liam and Natalie, and for a moment it was nothing more than a playful remark. But words have a way of planting roots. In America, when wealth and inheritance are involved, even a joke can turn into a seed of expectation. My estate, my jet, the trust fund I had carefully built, all of it gave substance to what might have been dismissed as idle talk. For Natalie, my comment was not forgotten. I began to notice the way her smile tightened when guests brought up the subject of children, the way her eyes lingered on the keys to the jet as if they symbolized more than travel. To her, a child meant not only family but power, status, and a guarantee of fortune. For Liam, the promise became a chain. He already carried the burden of medical reports that questioned his ability to father a child. Each reminder of my casual vow seemed to dig deeper into his pride. I saw him trying harder, drinking less for a while, speaking of doctors and treatments, only to retreat again into his old habits when disappointment struck. He would never admit it, but I knew my words had carved a silent pressure into his heart. Every family dinner, every holiday gathering, it was there like a shadow at his side. I often told myself that it had been nothing more than a joke, that no one would hold me accountable for a careless statement made in the glow of celebration. Yet in the quiet of the estate, I could feel the consequences taking shape. Natalie's eagerness and Liam's shame began to orbit around that promise, twisting it into something darker than I had ever intended. Looking back, I see now that it was in that moment of laughter, with wine in hand and family around me, that the seed of tragedy was planted. And though it seemed small, like a spark in a fireplace, it was destined to grow into a fire none of us could control. At first it was subtle, a sigh at the dinner table, a glance at a child in the garden, a quiet dab of a napkin against her eyes, as if emotion had crept up on her. Natalie knew how to play the part. She spoke often about her dream of becoming a mother, her voice trembling just enough to sound sincere. She mentioned renowned fertility doctors in Los Angeles and New York, citing treatments like IVF and ICSI as if she had researched them tirelessly. She begged for support, saying time was running out, that she and Liam needed every possible chance. Each time she asked for more money. She spoke of clinic deposits, surgical costs, consultations. I wanted to believe for the sake of the family, but the numbers never added up. Instead of medical receipts, I saw new designer handbags in her closet, luxury shoes tucked in their boxes, spa reservations and champagne brunches with her circle of socialites. She had mastered the art of wearing sorrow like a veil. At dinners she would lower her eyes and speak of her fears, and guests would nod with sympathy. She made herself appear as the dutiful wife willing to sacrifice anything to bring a child into the family. Yet I could not ignore the icy way she looked at Liam when the questions about children grew louder. Her glance was sharp, filled with silent blame, as though his weakness was the only barrier between her and destiny. It was never her failure, never her choice, always Liam's fault. The performance was convincing to most. Relatives would whisper about how sad it was, how tragic that such a young couple had been denied children. They praised Natalie for her patience, her strength, her tears. Only I saw the cracks. Only I noticed the designer credit card bills tucked into the mail pile, the way her shopping trips aligned perfectly with the money she claimed was for fertility treatments. I held my tongue, but inside I felt the slow tightening of suspicion. Natalie's brilliance was in making Liam believe her story too. She knew his shame was already deep, and she pressed on that wound with careful precision. She told him he had failed her, that he had failed the family, that without a child they were nothing but an empty marriage. He accepted it, shoulders bowed, eyes lowered, and in his silence she found more power. She positioned herself as the wronged wife, the tragic woman fighting fate, and in that role she not only won sympathy, but drained the family's wealth. I watched the act unfold each evening, and I realized I was not simply looking at a woman desperate for motherhood. I was looking at someone who used grief as a mask, who wielded disappointment as a weapon, and who was slowly turning my son into a shadow of himself. It was the beginning of a rift I could no longer ignore, the quiet storm gathering behind the perfect facade of our home. Jacob Anderson was 28 when he became our family's private pilot. He was the son of a distant cousin, which made him kin, though not close enough for familiarity. Tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of masculine presence that drew eyes, he looked like someone carved out of steel and sunlight. What unsettled me most was the resemblance he bore to my son. His jawline, his blue eyes, even the way he moved carried echoes of Liam. Perhaps that similarity was why Natalie's eyes lingered too long when Jacob entered the room. At first there was nothing unusual. Jacob had always been quiet, professional, a man who kept to himself. For years he only came to the estate when duty called, flying us to board meetings or family trips. He rarely joined us for meals, and when he did, his answers were brief, polite, almost shy. But lately his presence had shifted. I began to notice his car in the driveway on afternoons when no flights were scheduled. I saw him in the hallways at hours when Liam was away on business. His visits had multiplied, as if the jet demanded endless maintenance, though I knew better. Natalie was the one who created those opportunities. After each flight, she would insist Jacob stay for dinner, claiming it was rude to send him away hungry. She invented questions about the health of the engines, the safety of the jet, topics that required private conversations in the study or by the hangar. I once passed by and overheard her laughter, light and playful, a sound I had not heard from her in Liam's company for years. Then came the messages on her phone, quick and secretive, her fingers tapping when she thought no one was watching. Legally, none of this could be called a crime. In America, adults were free to dine and converse, but ethically, it was dangerous ground. A private pilot held a position of trust. To blur those lines with the employer's family was a violation of that unspoken code, one that could end a career if exposed. Older friends of mine would call it a scandal waiting to happen. I could already see the whispers forming if the truth ever left these walls. What struck me most was Natalie's demeanor. Around Liam, she was tense, often cold, her smile brittle. Yet in Jacob's presence, she transformed. Her body loosened, her laughter rang clear, her voice softened in a way that was almost tender. She was comfortable with him, too comfortable. And every time I witnessed it, I felt a chill of recognition. The fissure in my family was no longer hidden. It was widening, and Jacob had become the silent wedge driving it open. The Anderson estate was equipped with cameras in every hall and around every corner of the grounds. I had installed the system years ago, not out of paranoia, but out of habit. Wealth invites attention, and I had always believed in watching quietly. It was through these eyes of glass that I began to notice a troubling pattern. Jacob's car appeared at the gates at odd hours, long after midnight, or just before dawn when no flight was scheduled. Sometimes the cameras caught him walking through the side entrance, his posture calm as if he belonged, his presence at once familiar and suspicious. At first I tried to reason with myself. Perhaps there had been some technical problem with the jet. Perhaps he was just conscientious, checking the aircraft before an early trip. But the excuses crumbled when I recalled the truth. A pilot does not handle maintenance. That responsibility lies with certified FAA engineers, men with licenses and credentials, not with the one who flies. Jacob had no legitimate reason to be near the jet at such hours, and certainly no reason to be strolling inside my home. I decided to ask Natalie directly. I chose my words carefully, not accusing, only inquiring. Why was Jacob here so often when Liam was away? Her answer came smooth and quick, as if she had prepared it. He has to check the jet regularly to ensure our safety. It sounded neat. Too neat. Her voice carried just the right shade of worry, the tone of a dutiful wife speaking of precaution. But her eyes betrayed her. They did not hold fear or care. They held calculation. In the eyes of the law, her explanation was nonsense. A jury would see through it. Any aviation expert would dismiss it instantly. But I was not yet in a courtroom. I was a mother, a widow, a woman walking the quiet corridors of her home with the sense that something unclean was creeping in. I did not press her further. I smiled, I nodded, and I let her think she had convinced me. In truth, I was filing her words away like evidence, stacking them in a cabinet in my mind. I told myself to be patient. Without proof, suspicion is only a shadow. Yet shadows are the beginning of every storm. Each clip from the security footage, each excuse from Natalie, each hour Jacob lingered where he did not belong, all of it began to weave together in my thoughts. I had lived long enough to know that the truth always leaves footprints. And so I waited, silent, while the house hummed with secrets, recording every detail as if I were writing the first lines of a case yet to be tried. My Maltese was small, barely the size of a pillow, but her presence filled the house with a kind of watchful loyalty. She had been with me for years, always alert to moods and movements, always the first to sense unease before I did. It was she who began to reveal what my eyes wanted to ignore. Every time Natalie and Jacob were near each other, the dog would break into sharp, angry barks. Not the playful sound she made with guests, not the curious yips she gave to strangers, but a guttural, persistent sound that spoke of warning. It was as if she detected something foreign, some scent or energy that did not belong in the home. One afternoon I witnessed it clearly. Jacob had come into the sitting room while Liam was away, his voice low as he spoke with Natalie. The Maltese darted forward, teeth bared, barking with a fury I had never seen in her before. Instead of bending down to calm the animal, Natalie snapped. She shoved the dog aside with a rough hand, muttering under her breath. The gesture was so out of character that I froze. Natalie had always performed the role of gentle daughter-in-law, cooing sweet words, kissing cheeks, and offering trays of tea. To see her push my dog with open irritation revealed a side of her that no mask could cover. The dog returned to my side, growling softly, her body trembling as if she wanted to keep warning me. I stroked her fur, my mind turning over the memory like a stone in my hand. Animals are simple. They do not scheme or plot. They react to truth, to instinct. At my age, I had learned that sometimes the truest alarms come not from lawyers or cameras, but from a creature who cannot lie. I kept quiet, but inside I listened. The barking, the growling, the way Natalie flinched at the dog's attention, it all painted a picture. I could not yet prove betrayal, but I could feel it settling into the air like a storm pressing against the windows. And in the quiet of my thoughts, a sentence formed with chilling certainty. When my faithful dog growls, I know there is something wrong in this house, and the instincts of a woman, especially at 60, rarely miss their mark. It was supposed to be nothing more than a short trip, a weekend escape to clear my head. The private jet had sat unused for months, ever since Liam's business travels had slowed, and I had preferred the quiet of my estate. Still, something in me longed for the comfort of the skies, for the reminder that I was still a woman who could command her own path. So I told the staff to ready the plane, and I brought along my Maltese, who had always loved the hum of the engines. The cabin smelled faintly of leather and polish, familiar yet distant, like a room closed too long. I wandered forward to the cockpit, not because I intended to fly, but out of habit. I liked to make sure everything was in order, that the small luxuries I paid for were intact. I lowered myself into the pilot's seat, running my fingers along the armrests. That was when the dog began to bark. It was not her usual sharp cry of excitement, but a frantic, unsettling sound. She pawed at the floor, circling and yelping until my eyes followed her. I leaned down, adjusting the small light overhead, and there it was. Jammed beneath the seat, partially hidden, was a tube. I pulled it out, expecting perhaps lotion or hand cream left by a careless passenger. But the label stopped me cold. It was lubricant gel, the kind no one accidentally forgets, the kind no family trip could ever justify. For a long moment I simply stared at it, my breath caught in my chest. Liam had not flown this jet in more than a year. His health, his business, his habits kept him far from these leather seats. I knew his patterns. He would never have left something like this behind, which left only one explanation, one that burned through my mind like acid. Natalie. Natalie and Jacob. My hand trembled slightly as I turned the tube over, proof too intimate, too vulgar to be denied. A chill ran the length of my spine, not only from disgust but from recognition. This was no rumor, no whisper, no suspicious glance or half-truth. This was physical evidence, the first undeniable mark of betrayal inside my family's walls. The jet, once a symbol of my triumph and independence, suddenly felt defiled. I placed the tube carefully into my bag, as if it were toxic. My Maltese quieted, settling against my lap, but her eyes still fixed on the seat as if she knew what had been exposed. In that moment I understood that my suspicions were no longer shadows. They had taken form, sharp and undeniable, and they were sitting heavy in my hands. The air inside the cabin seemed colder, the silence thicker. I sat there clutching the tube, knowing my life had just split into two parts, before this discovery and after. As I sat with the small tube of gel in my hand, memories began to rearrange themselves in my mind like puzzle pieces sliding into place. Liam had not touched the jet in more than a year. His business dealings had quieted, and when he traveled, he preferred commercial flights, always saying it was simpler, less attention. Yet Natalie had flown often. She was always explaining it away with a light laugh, saying she needed the jet to escort friends to charity galas or to support fundraisers in neighboring cities. At the time, I accepted her excuses, though they left a bitter taste. Now, With this evidence clutched in my palm, those excuses took on a different shape. The law in America was clear in my thoughts. Jacob, as our contracted pilot, had the right to fly us anywhere the family requested, but he had no authority to use the jet outside those instructions. To step beyond that boundary was a violation of his agreement, a breach of trust that could cost him his license. The plane was a family asset, not a personal playground. For him to appear in our home at midnight hours, for Natalie to call on him when Liam was away, it was no longer just suspicious. It was improper. And if proven, it was actionable. I considered, for a flicker of a moment, confronting them both. I imagined storming into Natalie's room, thrusting the tube before her and demanding the truth. But the vision soured quickly. Without a chain of proof, without supporting evidence, the confrontation would collapse into shouting and denial. She would cry. Jacob would insist it was a mistake, and Liam, poor Liam, might even defend her. Then I would be the fool, the jealous old woman making accusations she could not substantiate. That was not who I was. I had built an empire on patience, on gathering facts, on waiting until the weight of truth could crush every lie. I knew better than to strike before the iron was ready. If I were to move against Natalie and Jacob, it would not be with suspicion alone. It would be with documents, witnesses, video, and law. I wanted control, not chaos. So I placed the tube back into my bag and closed the zipper as if sealing away a dangerous secret. My Maltese nestled into my lap, calm now, but my own mind was restless. I would not be reckless. I would wait, watch, and build. And when the moment came, I would hold every card in my hand, not just a single clue. That was the difference between rumor and justice, and I intended to deliver justice. I told myself I would not be reckless. I understood the weight of what I held in my hand, the small plastic tube that had been hiding under the pilot seat like a secret. It was one piece of evidence in a house full of whispers, but it was the first concrete thing, the first proof that moved suspicion from rumor into the realm of fact. For a while I paced the cabin, listening to the soft hum of the jet, as if the machine itself might advise me. I considered confrontation. I pictured the scene of me bursting into a room and exposing that tube, of calling for answers and watching faces contort between denial and panic. I thought about how easy it would be to be wrong. I thought about how a public accusation without corroboration would make me look foolish and petty and possibly ruin the life of my son who already carried enough shame. So I made a different choice. I took the tube with me and I replaced it with another topical preparation that would sting and cause immediate, unmistakable discomfort if applied to sensitive skin. I chose that course because I needed a controlled way to force the truth into daylight, to create an incident that would leave behind medical documentation and witnesses without intending permanent injury. I do not write this as instruction or as a lesson. I write it as a confession of a strategy born of desperation and calculation. I weighed risk and consequence. I understood that causing harm to another human being, even temporarily, was morally fraught. I also understood that in the balance between rumor and concrete proof, the safety of my son and the honor of my family could be defended only by evidence that the court and the company and polite society could not ignore. My choice was surgical in thought, clumsy in conscience. I told myself that the substance I substituted would not leave scars, that it would provoke a reaction strong enough to require medical attention, but not strong enough to cause long-term damage. I told myself this to steady the tremor in my hands. I thought about liability, about criminal charges, about whether what I did could be construed as malicious intent. I thought of the law and of attorneys, and of how a hospital report can change the course of a case more decisively than an argument shouted in a dining room. I thought about fairness and the ugliness of setting a trap, and I thought about how justice sometimes arrives only when the truth is forced into the light. When I put the substituted tube back under the seat and closed the panel, I felt a cold clarity I had not expected. It was not victory, it was a test. I had staged a situation where the consequences would expose the actors or relieve them of suspicion. I had chosen a path that walked the thin line between cunning and cruelty, and I knew the moral ledger would require accounting one day. For now, I would watch and gather. I would let the world reveal its own response to the provocation, and I would be ready to present what it chose to say. I had prepared myself for a long wait, but fate has a way of moving faster than patience. Only a week after I had replaced the tube, the incident unfolded with a violence that neither Natalie nor Jacob could conceal. They had arranged one of their secret flights, a rendezvous that disguised itself as a charitable engagement. I knew of it only after the fact, when whispers reached me from the staff and later from the hospital itself. On that flight, they used the tube. What they believed would fuel their passion instead turned into fire on their skin. The capsaicin did its work mercilessly. Within minutes, both of them were in agony, the cockpit filled with shouts and confusion. Jacob was forced to declare an emergency landing, his professional voice breaking as he contacted air traffic control. What should have been a discreet escape became a spectacle, a jet touching down ahead of schedule under the cover of medical urgency. At the hospital, the truth gained its first official mark. The doctors examined them, noting the strange pattern of burns, the inflamed skin in places that spoke louder than any denial. They wrote it down, clinical and detached, a medical report filed into the system. In America, such records carry weight beyond the hospital walls. They are documents admissible in court, evidence that cannot be erased by crocodile tears or quick excuses. I obtained a copy soon after through channels I had cultivated over decades. Reading it, my hands did not tremble. It was exactly what I had anticipated, though the starkness of the words struck me like a bell. Chemical irritation, patient reports of severe burning, prescribed treatment and follow-up. A chain of facts, neat and undeniable. For the first time, suspicion had moved from shadows into ink. The drama was no longer confined to the estate. It had crossed into the public record, into files stamped and signed by physicians. Natalie's mask of devotion, Jacob's veneer of professionalism, both now stained by an official account. This was no longer a family whisper or a mother's suspicion. It was a case waiting to be built, a fire that could not be smothered. As I sat in my study that evening, the Maltese curled at my feet, I allowed myself one deep breath of satisfaction. Not joy, not triumph, but the grim knowledge that the game had shifted. They had trapped themselves in my snare, and the world would now carry the proof for me. The path toward confrontation and justice had begun, lit by the glow of a hospital report neither of them could erase. I kept the medical report as carefully as one would guard a deed or a will. After the incident on the jet, Natalie and Jacob had no choice but to seek treatment. Their pain was too visible, their burns too obvious, and hospitals in this country do not allow such matters to vanish. Under American law, every patient is required to give an account of how an injury occurred. The staff must record it, and once recorded, it becomes part of the official medical history, protected by HIPAA, stored in servers that outlive excuses. When the private investigator handed me the first copy, obtained through the family attorney, I read it slowly, line by line. Chief complaint, burning and redness. Cause as reported by patient, exposure to topical cream. The notes included contradictions. Natalie claimed she had used a skincare product by accident. Jacob stated only that he had shared the same substance, unsure of how it happened. The language of denial was written into the very document that condemned them. Their stories did not match, and in the rigid structure of a medical report, such inconsistencies glow like neon. In the United States, these records cannot be altered by charm or manipulation. If divorce proceedings reached the discovery phase, the law would compel the hospital to produce them, stamped with dates, signed by doctors. A subpoena could draw them into the courtroom, where they would stand as silent witnesses, more eloquent than any speech. To claim this was a mere personal mishap would not erase the fact that both Natalie and Jacob entered a hospital on the same night, presenting the same intimate injuries, tied to a substance they should never have shared. I understood the power of that paper. It was not a photograph, not a whisper overheard in the hall. It was the state itself, the machinery of health and law, declaring that something had happened which required intervention. It was admissible, objective, and damning. The investigator had secured it properly, with the lawyer guiding every step, ensuring no line of legality was crossed. In a system as precise as America's, that mattered more than passion or anger. As I held the report, I thought of how far I had come from the first uneasy bark of my Maltese. What began as instinct had become a chain of facts, each linked by ink and seal. This was no longer a mother's suspicion. It was evidence, and it would survive denial. Natalie and Jacob had walked into a hospital seeking relief, and they had walked out leaving behind the very proof that would one day undo them. It happened on an ordinary morning, the kind of day when routine lulls the mind into thinking nothing unexpected could ever disturb the calm. I was reading in the sunroom when my Maltese came trotting proudly down the hall, dragging something white behind her. At first I thought it was one of my embroidered napkins from the dining set, but when I bent down to take it from her small jaws, my breath caught. It was a handkerchief, soft cotton, carefully pressed, with the initials J.A. stitched neatly in one corner. Jacob Anderson. The letters burned into my eyes like fire. The handkerchief itself was not remarkable, but its location was damning. My dog had come from Natalie's wing of the house. I had seen her slip out of that bedroom door only moments earlier, tail wagging as if she had uncovered treasure. And treasure it was, though not for the one who had left it behind. I turned the fabric over in my hands, feeling the weight of what it implied. What was Jacob's handkerchief doing in the private room of my daughter-in-law? There was no innocent answer, not in a household where boundaries were so well understood. In America, courts examine evidence with cold eyes. A single object is rarely enough to prove adultery, but physical evidence placed in the wrong context, combined with other records, flight logs, hotel invoices, medical reports, forms a chain that grows unbreakable. A handkerchief embroidered with his initials was not just cloth. It was a signature, carelessly abandoned in the wrong bed. I watched my Maltese circle at my feet, tail wagging, still pleased with her find. Loyal creatures do not know the weight of the secrets they reveal. She had no idea she had dragged a marriage closer to its breaking point. I stroked her head gently, whispering gratitude. It was as if the dog had become my accomplice, the silent guardian who pointed me to truths hidden behind locked doors and rehearsed smiles. Holding that handkerchief, I felt the puzzle tighten. It was the missing piece that bound the others together. No longer was I looking at random suspicion or scattered clues. Now I had physical proof that belonged to Jacob, in Natalie's space, carried out into the light not by me, not by a detective, but by fate disguised as a faithful dog. I folded it carefully, slipped it into a drawer where I kept the other files, and sat for a long moment in silence. This was not mere coincidence. It was confirmation. The estate itself, through its walls, its cameras, its faithful dog, was handing me the truth. Piece by piece, betrayal was stitching its own case against them, and I would be the one to present it when the time came. I knew the time for silent observation was ending. A storm was coming, and storms require preparation. I gathered every piece I had collected: the investigators' photographs, the hotel invoices, the transcripts of burner phone messages, the medical report with its cold clinical phrases, the camera footage from the estate halls, and finally the handkerchief with Jacob's initials that my Maltese had delivered like fate itself. Each item I placed in a folder, one atop another, until the stack felt heavy enough to crush the lies that had lived too long in my house. I called our family attorney, a man who had served us for decades. He had helped me build trust funds, negotiate contracts, protect patents, but now I needed him for something more personal. When he sat across from me in the study, I slid the folder forward. He read silently for a long time, adjusting his glasses, turning each page with the patience of a surgeon. When he finally looked up, there was no doubt in his voice. "This is grounds for fault-based divorce." He explained the advantages. In many states, proving adultery allows the innocent spouse to claim a larger share of the marital estate. Liam would not be left weakened. He would walk away protected, and she, Natalie, would face the financial consequences of her betrayal. The attorney outlined the next step with precision. Parallel to the divorce proceedings, we would move against Jacob's career. Pilots are not free agents. They are bound by codes, contracts, and the oversight of the Federal Aviation Administration. To use a private aircraft for personal misconduct was not merely poor judgment, it was a breach of professional ethics and a violation of FAA safety standards. He would draft a packet to send both to the FAA and to the airline that contracted Jacob. It would contain flight logs, proof of unauthorized trips, and the medical documentation that tied those flights to scandal. A career can take years to build, but only one file to end. I listened carefully, my hands folded, my eyes steady. This was no longer only about betrayal in a marriage bed. This was about consequence. Natalie would lose her standing as wife, stripped of wealth and status. Jacob would lose his wings, grounded not by weather but by the truth. Together, their empire of secrecy would collapse. As I saw the attorney close the folder and tuck it under his arm, I felt both heavy and clear. This was not vengeance alone. It was strategy, precise and lawful. I had laid my trap, and now the machinery of law would do the rest. My role was simple. I had to wait for the stage to rise and the curtain to open. And when it did, the world would see not rumor, not suspicion, but the weight of proof. The night of the party arrived with the kind of polish my family was once known for. The Anderson estate glowed under rows of lanterns, the garden trimmed to perfection, strings of jazz drifting through the air. Guests arrived in evening gowns and black suits, the kind of faces that filled society pages. Investors, patrons of the arts, cousins and in-laws who loved to linger in the orbit of wealth. Glasses of wine were raised, laughter spilled across the marble floors, and for a moment it looked like nothing had ever been wrong. But I knew better. I had chosen this evening with intent. It was not only a celebration, it was a stage. In America, truth carries a sharper edge when revealed in public. People may doubt documents, may question whispers, but when evidence unfolds under the eyes of family and friends, there is no return. I moved through the room with calm dignity, greeting guests, offering smiles that never reached my eyes. Inside, I was steel. My son Liam looked uneasy, hovering by the bar. He had not yet seen the evidence in full, though he had sensed the chill between his wife and me. Natalie, radiant in a crimson dress, played her role perfectly, charming relatives with stories, brushing Liam's arm as if devotion were her second skin. Jacob was not present yet, though his shadow lingered in every glance she cast toward the door. As the night deepened, I let the music soften, signaled the staff to still the chatter. A hush fell, not total but enough to shift attention. I stood near the grand fireplace, the portraits of Anderson ancestors looming above me, and raised my glass. I thanked the guests for their presence, spoke briefly of family, of loyalty, of truth. My voice was steady, but my eyes never left Natalie. Some guests smiled politely, unaware of what was coming. Others sensed the tension, leaning forward as if they could already smell the storm. The gathering was no longer just a party. It had become an unofficial courtroom, with chandeliers for spotlights and family ties for jurors. The stage was set, not for celebration, but for revelation. Every laugh that had filled the room earlier now seemed brittle, waiting to shatter. I looked at my Maltese resting quietly at my feet, the faithful witness to every secret uncovered. My heart slowed, steadied, and I knew the moment had come. Soon the folder of evidence would open, and what had been whispered in shadows would roar into the light. The Anderson estate, once the stage of Natalie's lies, was about to host her unmasking. The clinking of crystal glasses still echoed when I placed mine down. My voice cut through the hum of conversation, sharp yet measured. Today I did not invite you here only to dine. I invited you to witness the truth. The room froze. Faces turned toward me, curiosity flickering into unease. Natalie's smile stiffened, her knuckles tightening around her glass. Liam's brow furrowed, confusion crossing his features. I moved slowly, deliberately, as if presiding over a trial. From a folder beside me, I drew the first item, a shirt. Jacob's shirt, left behind on the jet. I held it up, the faint scent of women's perfume clinging to the fabric. Gasps broke the silence. Someone whispered, "That is not Liam's." I placed it on the table. The second layer came next. Hotel receipts, pages of them, aligned with dates and destinations of the Anderson jet. Chicago, Miami, Los Angeles. I read them aloud, the numbers cold, undeniable. The paper trembled only in Natalie's hands, not in mine. I let the murmurs rise before I set them down beside the shirt. Then, the handkerchief, white, embroidered with J.A. The Maltese had delivered it to me like a messenger of fate, and now I displayed it under the chandeliers. Why would Jacob Anderson's initials appear in Natalie's private quarters? The room seemed to hold its breath. I laid it gently, completing the triangle of betrayal forming on the polished wood. The fourth piece was heavier. The medical report. Clinical language describing chemical burns on both Natalie and Jacob, treated on the same night. I read the words slowly, each syllable echoing. Chemical irritation, severe burning. Patients Natalie Crawford and Jacob Anderson. The record bore the weight of law, not rumor. I handed it to my attorney, who stood quietly in the corner, as if to remind everyone this was more than spectacle. Finally, the video. Projected onto a discrete screen, the footage showed Jacob entering the estate in the dead of night, slipping down halls reserved for family. Frame after frame, date after date. No excuses could erase images caught by our own security system. Gasps turned to silence. The picture was complete. I looked around. Every piece was a puzzle fragment, alone, perhaps explainable, together, undeniable. The room no longer smelled of wine and jasmine. It smelled of shame. Liam's face had drained of color, his chest rising and falling as though he had been struck. Natalie trembled, her charm crumbling. The whispers had turned into judgment, a jury of family and peers passing silent verdicts. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The evidence spoke for me, each piece louder than the last. By the time I closed the folder, the portrait was clear. Betrayal had a face, and it was standing in the center of my living room. Natalie's mask cracked the moment the last piece of evidence was laid bare. Her eyes darted wildly, searching for an escape that did not exist. Then the tears came, heavy and theatrical. She pressed a trembling hand to her chest and sobbed that it was all a mistake, a misunderstanding, nothing more than an accident spun into something sinister. Her voice climbed and fell like a desperate actress forgetting her lines, and yet every word rang hollow. She pointed toward Jacob, though he was not yet in the room, insisting that he had misled her, that she had never truly crossed a line. But then, in the same breath, she stumbled into contradiction. One moment she wailed that there had never been intimacy at all. The next she snapped that what had happened was not serious, not worth ruining a family over. Gasps rippled through the crowd. She did not hear them. Her panic drowned out reason. In America, such contradictions are fatal. Lawyers call it impeachment evidence, the kind of testimony that destroys credibility. A person who cannot keep her story straight is a person a jury will not believe. And Natalie, in her hysteria, was handing me more than I could have bought with all the investigators in the world. She was unraveling herself, pulling her own threads loose in front of everyone who mattered. The room watched as her polished poise collapsed into chaos. Relatives shifted uncomfortably, some averting their eyes, others staring with open fascination at the spectacle. Friends who once admired her glamour now whispered into their glasses, their judgment harsher than mine could ever be. Liam stood frozen, torn between heartbreak and fury, as his wife begged for understanding that would not come. She clutched at my arm once, pleading that she had only wanted to save her marriage, that she had been confused, pressured, lonely. But the words tumbled over one another, forming a tangle of excuses that contradicted everything she had claimed minutes earlier. Her voice cracked, her sobs echoed against the marble, and the chandeliers above seemed to glitter with cruel indifference. I did not need to argue. I did not need to raise my voice. Natalie's own panic was dismantling her facade piece by piece, under the weight of the very people whose approval she craved. And as she collapsed into her contradictions, I knew the crowd would remember not just the evidence I presented, but the spectacle of her undoing. When Jacob was finally called into the room, the air tightened as though every breath had been drawn in and none released. He entered quietly, his uniform pressed but his shoulders stooped, as if he already knew the verdict. Natalie looked at him with wide, frantic eyes, pleading for rescue, but he offered none. I asked him directly, my voice sharp enough to cut through the murmurs. "Jacob Anderson, do you deny these accusations?" For a moment, silence stretched like a rope about to snap. He lowered his gaze, lips pressed into a line, and said nothing. In American law, silence in such a moment can become as heavy as words. Admission by silence, they call it, when a man refuses to deny a charge leveled openly and clearly. And so, his silence became an answer louder than denial could ever be. Around the room, the family stirred. Some gasped, some muttered in outrage. A cousin demanded how long this betrayal had gone on. An uncle shook his head, his voice rising in anger about the disgrace brought upon the Anderson name. The room shifted from party to tribunal, every guest now part of a jury delivering judgment. Liam stood apart, his face drained of life. He had always loved his cousin Jacob, had once admired him as the daring pilot who carried the Anderson family skyward. To see him now, bowed and mute before the weight of truth, was a blow deeper than any fist. His eyes flicked to Natalie, who sobbed dramatically, and then back to the evidence spread across the table. There was no refuge left in denial. The shirt, the hotel bills, the medical report, the handkerchief, the footage. It was all there, and Jacob's silence only sealed it. For a moment, Liam did not move. His chest rose and fell as though he were underwater, drowning on dry land. Then his hands clenched into fists at his side, not in rage but in devastation. The pain of betrayal was carved into his face, visible to all who watched. He was not only losing a wife, but also a cousin, a friend, and perhaps a part of himself. That recognition silenced the room more than my words ever could. I remained still, letting the weight of the silence fill every corner. This was the peak, the place where every mask had fallen, where lies no longer held. Jacob's refusal to speak had condemned him. Natalie's frantic tears had betrayed her. And Liam's shock, raw and unguarded, was the proof of how deeply their treachery had cut. In that moment, I felt no triumph, only the stern certainty that justice, in its harshest form, had finally been delivered under my roof. The days after the party unfolded like the slow closing of a heavy door. The whispers from that night traveled fast, but Liam did not wait for rumors to finish their course. With the guidance of our attorney, he filed a fault-based divorce in state family court. In America, such a petition is precise. It requires evidence, and evidence we had in abundance: hotel invoices, security footage, text messages, and even the testimony of relatives who had watched Natalie collapse under her own contradictions. The case was no longer about suspicion or shame. It was about law, stamped, filed, and binding. The judge reviewed the initial filings with the cold efficiency of someone who had seen too many marriages collapse. Adultery, proven by documented records, leaves little room for negotiation. Under state law, a spouse found guilty of infidelity loses much of the privilege that might have accompanied divorce under other circumstances. Natalie could not reach for the trust fund. She could not claim the private jet, the estate, or the financial instruments designed to preserve our family's wealth. Those were to remain with Liam, secured for the Anderson name and legacy. The ruling came swiftly. Natalie would receive alimony, yes, but only the statutory minimum. The court explained it plainly: enough to prevent abandonment, but nothing more. A modest monthly payment, symbolic rather than generous, a legal acknowledgement that she had once been a wife, but had forfeited her standing by betraying her vows. I sat behind Liam during the hearing, the Maltese nestled at my feet, watching Natalie's face as the words were read aloud. Once she had commanded rooms with her beauty, her poise, her air of belonging. Now she stared at the floor, her hands twisting nervously, her lips drawn tight as though she might still find a way to charm her way out. But no charm can touch a gavel. The judge's voice was firm, final, impartial. The verdict was not mine, not even Liam's. It was the state declaring that her place in this family and in its fortune was ended. For Natalie, it was more than financial loss. It was humiliation. She had walked into the Anderson estate as a woman cloaked in luxury, draped in silk and jewels, courted by high society. She walked out of court as a divorcee stripped of privilege, with only the bare minimum required by law. The descent was steep and merciless, and as the papers were signed, I felt no need to gloat. Justice had spoken in its own language, and the silence that followed was more powerful than any celebration. Jacob's downfall arrived swiftly, not with the roar of engines, but with the silence of revoked authority. Within days of the party, the file my attorney had prepared was delivered to the airline that contracted him and to the Federal Aviation Administration. There was no drama in those offices, no raised voices or tears, only the cold language of regulations and codes of ethics. The evidence spoke for itself. A pilot who had used a private jet for personal misconduct, who had entangled his profession with scandal, who had treated the cockpit like a stage for betrayal. The FAA does not forgive such breaches. To them, every act of poor judgment carries the shadow of risk. A man who could compromise professionalism for desire was a man who might compromise safety in the air. Their review was swift. His license was suspended pending investigation, a bureaucratic phrase that in truth meant his wings were already clipped. The airline followed with its own decision. Effective immediately, Jacob Anderson is relieved of duty. A dismissal letter written in sterile language but sharp as any blade. When the final ruling came, the permanent revocation of his commercial pilot license, it was as though the sky itself had closed above him. Years of training, thousands of hours logged, the pride he once carried in his uniform, all reduced to a line in a database. Revoked. For a pilot, it was a life sentence. He would never sit in a cockpit again, never sign a flight log, never feel the vibration of engines under his command. The press wasted no time. Local news outlets latched onto the story, hungry for the spectacle of a scandal that touched both wealth and aviation. Headlines painted him as reckless, dishonorable, unfit. His photograph appeared beneath bold letters, his name paired forever with words like disgrace and affair. In small towns and city terminals, his fall became a cautionary tale, whispered among young pilots about how quickly a career can collapse. I watched it all unfold from my study, the Maltese at my side, the papers stacked neatly as if waiting for my approval. I had not destroyed Jacob with fury. I had simply opened the door and let the truth walk out. His silence at the party had condemned him before family. Now the institutions that once gave him stature condemned him before society. It was not triumph I felt, but inevitability. Jacob had gambled his honor for desire, and in aviation, honor is everything. Without it, the sky itself banishes you. And so he fell, not in fire or steel, but in shame. A pilot grounded forever, his name carried only by the wind of scandal. For generations, the Anderson family had treated honor as carefully as they treated their wealth. In business, in marriage, in public life, reputation was the currency that outlasted money. After the revelations, after the court filings and the scandal that stained our name, the family gathered privately. There were no raised voices, no debates. The decision was unanimous. Natalie Crawford and Jacob Anderson would be cut away like rot from a tree. Letters went unanswered, invitations were withdrawn, phone calls were never returned. It was not rage, it was exile. In high society, silence can be sharper than condemnation. At the next gala, when Natalie arrived in a dress she had once worn proudly, conversations broke off mid-sentence. Women turned their shoulders. Men offered only cold nods before drifting away. Her name no longer belonged to the glittering world of benefactors and patrons. It belonged to gossip. People whispered as champagne glasses clinked. That's her. The one who betrayed for money. The one who thought she could cheat an Anderson and still sip wine at our tables. She lasted less than an hour before leaving, her heels clicking against marble in a rhythm that sounded like retreat. Jacob fared no better. The Anderson relatives who had once admired his confidence now refused to acknowledge him. Uncles and cousins who had raised glasses to his promotions in aviation now spat his name as if it tasted bitter. The wider circle of acquaintances closed its doors to him, not because of law, but because of shame. For a man who had once flown high above them all, the fall into social darkness was absolute. In America's upper tier, reputation is not decoration. It is access. Doors opening to business ventures, charitable boards, private clubs. When that reputation collapses, everything else follows. Natalie discovered this with painful speed. Where once boutiques sent her invitations for private viewings, now clerks avoided her eyes. Where once she could summon favors with a phone call, her number went to voicemail or block lists. The world of silk and chandeliers thrives on purity of image, and hers was ruined beyond repair. I watched it from the quiet of my estate, not with glee, but with a kind of weary inevitability. Natalie had gambled for fortune and found only infamy. Jacob had reached for desire and found disgrace. The family remained intact, scarred but standing, while they became pariahs in the very circles they once craved. For the Andersons, honor endured. For Natalie and Jacob, it was gone, and without it, they were nothing. Just when it seemed Natalie had reached the lowest point of her fall, another truth surfaced, darker than the last. My attorney, meticulous and relentless, combed through financial records in preparation for the divorce settlement. What he uncovered was not mere carelessness, but deliberate deceit. Natalie had been quietly transferring money from her joint account with Liam into an offshore fund, a secret nest egg shared with Jacob. It was not a large fortune compared to the Anderson legacy, but it was enough to reveal intent. Theft masked as secrecy, betrayal carried out in numbers and wires. Under American law, marriage is not only a union of hearts, but a binding financial partnership. Each spouse owes the other what is called fiduciary duty, the responsibility to manage shared assets with honesty and transparency. To strip funds away in secret, to hide them for selfish gain, is a violation as clear as adultery. The discovery lit a second fire. Not only was Natalie guilty of infidelity, she was now guilty of financial fraud. The civil lawsuit was prepared almost immediately. My lawyer drafted the filings with precision, accusing her of fraudulent transfers and breach of fiduciary duty. The relief sought was clear: restitution, damages, and the freezing of any accounts linked to her secret dealings. For a woman who once spent without limit, who reveled in the gleam of jewels and designer handbags, the thought of her assets locked away was a punishment sharper than iron bars. The news reached Liam through the attorney's office. His face, already pale from betrayal, turned stone cold as the new details unfolded. He had been humiliated as a husband, but now he saw that his trust had been mocked as well. Every paycheck deposited, every inheritance carefully managed, had been prey to her schemes. His silence was no longer confusion. It was resolve. The case would go forward. For Natalie, the consequences multiplied. To society, she was already disgraced. To the courts, she was now a defendant in two arenas: family law and civil fraud. Reporters whispered of a frozen lifestyle, of lawsuits stacking against her like storm clouds. The irony was merciless. She had chased wealth through manipulation, betrayal, and risk. Instead of gaining more, she had condemned herself to lose everything, and more than everything: her dignity, her freedom to spend, her place in the world. I reflected on it in the quiet of evening, the Maltese curled by my chair, the estate serene as though untouched by the chaos that had unfolded. Karma, I thought, is not always poetic. Sometimes it is legal, sometimes it is financial, and sometimes it is both, arriving in layers that strip away every illusion until nothing remains but truth. For Natalie, karma had arrived swift, relentless, and absolute. The garden was still wet with dew when I stepped outside, the Maltese trotting at my side, its small paws brushing through the trimmed grass. The sun had just begun to lift itself over the horizon, painting the sky in soft pinks and gold, casting long, forgiving shadows across the estate. For the first time in weeks, perhaps months, the air did not feel heavy. It felt clear, light, as though the house itself had exhaled after holding its breath too long. I walked slowly down the gravel path, listening to the crunch of stones under my shoes, letting the quiet sink into me. My little companion barked once, then settled, as if sensing the peace I was trying to embrace. In that calm, my thoughts turned inward, to the storm we had survived. I had defended my son. I had defended our family's name. No one could deny that. But as the morning light warmed my face, another question rose from somewhere deep within me. Does true happiness come from revenge or from forgiveness? I whispered the thought aloud, not to the dog, not even to the garden, but to myself. The sound vanished into the air, leaving only the stillness behind. From a distance, I saw Liam standing at the edge of the lawn. His posture was uncertain, shoulders weighted with pain, yet there was something new in his expression. Not just grief, resolve, the kind a man wears when he knows he must build again from rubble. His eyes met mine for a moment, and I saw in him both the boy I had raised and the man who now had to walk a harder road. I wanted to reach out, but I knew this step was his to take. Sometimes love is not in the embrace, but in the distance we allow, so another can rise on their own. The garden filled with silence, broken only by the breeze moving the branches above us. I breathed in deeply and felt the bittersweet truth. Justice had been done. Betrayal had been revealed. Yet life was not about endings, but about what begins afterward. As the sun climbed higher, I knew that the story was no longer mine alone. And so, I turn outward now to you. Perhaps you too have seen betrayal inside a family. Perhaps you have felt the sharp sting of trust broken. Tell me then, does revenge bring peace? Or is it forgiveness, quiet and unseen, that allows the soul to rest? Share your stories, your thoughts, your truths, for in them perhaps we may all discover what happiness truly means.